In this video, we're going to talk about the 100,000 Jews that died at the hands of the Nazis. And it all started here in this area right where we stand. When the Germans occupied Kyiv on September 27th, 1941, it only took them a few days to round up a lot of journalists and create over 2,000 signs and print out newspapers that directed all Jews that lived in Kyiv to come down here on the spot on Monday, the 29th of September 1941, and gather here. If they were to be found anywhere else, they were to be shot momentarily. Obviously, Nazis patrolled the synagogues, they patrolled the streets, and any Jew that went to the synagogue on that day would also be taken here. Anyone who would not essentially obey the orders would risk getting shot. We're located at the intersection of Mahilkovska and Doktorivka Street. They have been renamed, obviously, and things have changed. But back then, this place was the outskirts of Kyiv. There was nothing but ravines and little huts where people lived. But these streets, they sort of remained since that time, and they're still here. And right now, we can all see for ourselves where it all started. As we make our way to the execution sites, we're going to walk down, and I guess I'm going to try to explain to you guys. Persecutions didn't start nearly at that time, at 1941. They happened way before that. Starting from 1936, we had persecutions from the Soviet Union. Their job was to strike terror into the Ukrainian population, into the Soviet population, and you've had a lot of mass graves and mass executions all over Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine. For example, the Vinnytsia massacre is estimated to have about 12,000 victims, and the Bukovina burial grounds in the Kyiv Oblast, they have about over 200,000 or more, still unestimated how many people have been killed over there. So we're at this corner where the Jews would have been driven off on this side of the road. On the left side, we have the war cemetery. It's called the military cemetery. And then further down, we have the Lukyanivka cemetery. This is the path that the Jews would have taken. They would have been hoarded up in here and then driven further down this road. So what did actually happen between September 26 and 27 in 1941? Quite a lot of people gathered on that infamous intersection. Some estimates account that more than 1,500 people have gathered, and that's a lot of people. And many eyewitness accounts say that people that were walking on this path were, most of them were children, women, the elderly, and that's because the majority of men were out fighting in the war here in Kyiv. So eyewitness accounts say that they looked tired, many looked worn out, many looked like they were walking with their heads down. So these people certainly knew the fate that awaited them. They knew that they were going to die, essentially. They were asked to bring belongings, they were asked to bring jewelry, money, whatever they had with them. All of that was taken away from them. However, as they got closer and closer to the ravines, their passports were burned, items that they had were taken away. However, luggages and big items, they were taken away earlier, and Jews were promised that they would be given to them by train. They would just send for relocation, and they would receive their item, their belongings, by train. The fact of the matter is, as this walk, this infamous walk progressed, what happened was, with every step, it seems like there was less and less hope that they would come back alive. As mentioned before, many Jews were not aware of the fate that awaited them. They brought with them their valuables, their blankets, their jewelry. They were all confiscated at different spots of the journey. And right here we are in the actual execution site where the execution happened. And the first one was just further down. You had the German guards were telling people to move along, and those that weren't moving along, they let out dogs on them. I mean, that was a final demonstration of what was going to happen to them. It's like nobody had any illusions at that point. Right now we're behind the Dorogozhitsy subway station here in Ukraine. By behind I mean we're north of it. Along this road we have separate 3 execution zones along this path. As you cross more to the west, there's a road called Untitled Street, and back then that road didn't exist, and you have 2 more execution zones further ahead. Right now we're located at an approximate location of the 2nd execution site. Behind me there's a monument. I suppose it marks that location. And a bit more about the whole process. So what happened was the Jews that gathered at the corner of Melnikovska and Dehotarivska Street, they numbered in quite a large number, about 1,500, because more Jews were bought over there. As more Jews were bought, other Jews were divided into groups of a few hundred, from 300 to 500 people, and they all marched to different execution sites. So every site saw quite a lot of people. And in general, you have to understand that this whole ravine cost the lives of about 30,000 people. More than that, probably up to 40,000, depending on the estimates. So this is the 2nd execution site, and we're going to make our way to the next one. So we're standing at 2 more execution sites, one around behind me and one further closer to the street of Untitled. One other thing that I forgot to mention, how these Jews were driven to these execution spots. First of all, I said that people gathered out of their own accord at the section. So other times, German officers ransacked Jewish residences, known Jewish residences, forcibly removed Jews from there as well. There's also further south, there's a railway station called the Lukyanovska railway station, and a lot of Jews also went there because they assumed that they will be deported or they're going to be resettled somewhere else, and Germans were also waiting for them there to take them to Babyn Yar, to this location right here. And last but not least, as I mentioned, the synagogues were also staffed by Germans. Germans were there, they were guarding them, and obviously those unfortunate Jews that went to the synagogue at the end of September on these 2 days, September 27th to 29th, they unfortunately never returned home, and they ended up here as well. So we made our way to the last 2 execution sites here. That's part of Babi Yar. This used to be a huge ravine over here that crossed this Untitled Street that's behind me. And as you can see, it was all built up in the 60s. These buildings look like the 5-story Khrushchevka type of buildings that were built in the 60s. So obviously, you can imagine that these buildings stand on a huge pile of essentially dead bodies. There must be tens of hundreds of bodies and remains here where we stand. And these buildings were built on top of the remains. The master planned community that was built by the Soviets it took precedence. There were 2 execution sites next to each other because this ravine sort of ended right here where we are. The ravine went across this whole area, and it went way past where currently the Dorogozhitsy station is. We're located right in front of the Babi Yar monument. It's south of the actual mass graves and the ravine. However, this is the actual park dedicated to the Babi Yar victims. This park used to be the site of the Syretsk concentration camp. It used to operate from spring of 1941 to October or fall of 1943. So basically this camp housed fighters, underground fighters, prisoners of war, and individuals that were captured around Kyiv that were undesirable, like the Romas and the Ukrainian nationals and those sorts of people. By some estimates, this camp held about 2,000 prisoners when it opened in 1941. However, that number dropped down to 1,500. The camp closed in 1943, and the main reason was that a lot of deaths have occurred here due to malnutrition, issues surrounding forced labor, illnesses, and that sort of thing. By 1943, this camp's duties were also expanded to kill Jews that were not murdered earlier in 1941. However, the vast majority of the prisoners here were prisoners of war, and by some estimates, in this area, over 30,000 prisoners of war have perished in various concentration camps in this area. There were other concentration camps called Gulag 201 and Gulag 205. Gulag 201 was around here as well, and Gulag 205 was around Darnitsa, which is on the left bank of Kyiv. Gulags are Dunschanzlagers, or basically German camps under military occupation. These were designed to be temporary camps to house people to perform work that were going to be shipped out west towards Germany to work there. But in many cases, these camps more or less were made a permanent fixture and housed people here to work, and eventually many cases died. In general, it's estimated that Nazis have captured 1.4 million of prisoners of war here in Ukraine. However, anywhere from 600,000 to 700,000 have perished in Ukraine, and this area is one of those areas that have seen the majority of these deaths. What did the citizens of Kyiv, non-Jewish citizens, think of Babi Yar? In 1943, few citizens were able to comprehend that mass murders would be happening right next door to where they were living. The overwhelmingly common thought was that Jews were simply being deported to a different place. The sound of gunshots didn't travel too far because Nazis were careful to conceal it with music, and they were careful where these shots were traveling, and they made sure to muffle the sound of these shots with the ravines, with lots of nature that surrounded these ravines. In the end, even after the massacres happened, Germans brought up a huge cleanup operation. The cleanup operation was handled by about 150 SS members, and they were all obviously burned, and lots of ashes were pretty much gathered in the places of the massacres. There was a lot of smoke coming up that eyewitnesses remembered. However, it was very difficult for the vast majority of the people to comprehend that mass murders were actually literally happening right where they were living. Lastly, it's worth noting the massive impact that this had on Kyiv as a city. You have to realize that before the war started in 1940, Kyiv had a population of over 1 million people. 200,000 of these, that's roughly a quarter of these people, they were drafted into the army. There were men drafted into the army. Still, it's worth noting that over 300,000 of Kyivans evacuated Kyiv. Many were just simply scared of German invasion, and they were just afraid. They could not fight back. When the Germans actually came to Kyiv, roughly half of the population was gone. Kyiv only had about 400,000 people, and it's worth noting that 100,000 of these were Jews that ended up losing their lives. Behind me there is a tower, a TV tower that was built in 1972 by the Soviets. According to legend and according to obviously evidence, over 10 meters of ash was found when they were digging the foundation out for the tower. And that 10 meters of ash was obviously because the Germans were concealing their crimes. And prisoners from the Syretsk concentration camp were used to do this. And there were over 100 prisoners that were helping in these efforts. In the end, after this tower was built, this park was also created. Now we can all remember these atrocities and come here and pay respect to these people that lost their lives. So as a conclusion, let's wrap up the facts. The fact of the matter was, when the Nazis arrived into Kyiv, there were about 400,000 people. When Kyiv was liberated by the Soviets, the population of Kyiv was 180,000. So more than half of the population of Kyiv disappeared. That goes out to tell you just how much losses this country suffered and the city suffered. Basically, on that note, I'm going to wrap up, and let me know in the comments what you think of this video, and I'll see you in the next one.